Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man, they say murder 3? Strange things that happen here, how stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?
And welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James. My wife and I attended the Bigfoot conference in Huntsville, Texas, recently. It was quite an adventure. We towed our travel trailer up and spent some time in the Huntsville State Park, which is right next to the Sam Houston National Park. Interestingly enough, there have been many Bigfoot sightings in the national park, as well as a few in the state park. All we got to see was an alligator. The meet and greet dinner was held on Friday night. It was packed. Joseph Emmett sat at our table. He is the city council member who was there representing the city of Huntsville. With so many folks in attendance, the city figured they should show their appreciation. We spent most of our time discussing historical events in and around the area. There's a lot more to Huntsville than just the prison. M.K. Davis was sitting next to me, so I asked if he'd like to come on Strange Things. He immediately gave me his phone number and said to call. M.K. was on the show last week. He has spent a lot of time examining the Patterson-Gimlin film as well as other interesting videos. Nick Redfern was in line with us waiting to get our food. We talked a bit and he told me his latest book would be out soon. Of course, I asked Nick to come on the show again, and he said he'd love to. And now I just have to catch him at a good time so we can do an interview. Lyle Blackburn spoke after dinner. He told us about the movie called The Mothman of Point Pleasant. Lyle does the narration for the movie. Saturday, just before the speakers took the stage, I got to speak to Greg, who'd had a Bigfoot encounter in 1980 when he was 12. He and some friends were out hiking along Bluff Creek in Winters, Texas, which is west from Fort Worth. As they were crossing a bridge, Greg spotted what he thought was a cow down in the bottom of the creek. It stood up and it looked at him. It was huge and covered in hair. It was not a bear or any animal Greg had ever seen. Greg turned to ask his friends if they'd seen the thing too, only to find out that everybody else had already started running for their lives. Later, Greg found out that 4 others had seen the same creature. They all agreed it was no cow or bear or any animal. It looked just like a Bigfoot. Ken Gerhard was there, so I talked to him a bit. Then I finally managed to get with Jeff Crypto Hulk Stewart for the first time. He's already been on the show 3 times, but I only now got to speak to him in person. Cliff Barrickman was there, so I gave him the coffee I'd promised him back in January when he was on. There were a few others who I talked with about being on Strange Things. If it works out, we should have a good next few months. James Bobo Fay was one of the speakers. I wanted to ask him to come on Strange Things. During a break at the conference, I spotted Bobo standing by the wall, talking to folks who all had lined up, and they wanted to speak to him and get their photo taken with the Bigfoot hollerer. You can't call Bobo a Bigfoot whisperer. He doesn't whisper. We got in line and waited, and waited, and waited a little more. Just as we were about to get our chance, Bobo was pulled away to go back to his table in the vendors section. It would seem there was a line of people waiting for him there, too. My wife said we should go and try it again, so we got in the back of the line and we started waiting some more. It was not a bad time. A man standing in line behind us got to talking about his Bigfoot encounter. The man worked for the state and therefore didn't want to come on the show in case of problems at work, but he did tell me his story. He was with a group of men during a forest fire. They all were sent to a fenced-in area to await orders. He just mentioned jokingly they were now in Bigfoot Central. No one paid him any mind until something big started prowling around the edge of the fence. They all heard what sounded like hoots, kind of like what you hear on TV. It was coming from all around them. There was also something walking around in the dark and always managing to stay just out of sight. As they sat there listening, they all heard the sound of something stepping on some metal parts on their side of the fence. This creature had stepped over a barbed wire fence. It had to have stepped over the top strand because you can't climb a fence without making sound. This would make the thing at least 8 feet tall. It stepped on some metal roofing material in the dark and then scurried away before anybody could get a look at it. The man did go looking with his flashlight, but he didn't see any creature. The man in our line then talked about how there was a connection between UFO sightings, orbs, Bigfoot, and folks going missing. He'd done some research and found that when people reported seeing UFOs, there were also several Bigfoot sightings at about the same time. Then the papers would tell about someone who was missing in the woods that also had happened at the same time. This is mostly in the Liberty County area. Liberty County is just southeast from the Sam Houston Forest. I was writing notes as fast as I could, having to hold my notebook as I worked. I put down as much as I could, and I hope I got the details right. In my haste, I forgot to get his contact information, so I could have him check my details before telling them to the world. If this sounds like you, send me a note at strangethings@arkanasa.com so I can get all the facts straight. The event was quite a success. There were over 1,000 people in the audience. If you've never been to a conference like this, you should try. The Jefferson Bigfoot Conference is coming up in October. Now, don't wait too long. Last year they sold out of tickets before the conference even started. We have our tickets already. For more details, check out the Texas Bigfoot Research Center on Facebook and find out how to attend. While in Huntsville, I ran around lining up guests for the show, and I got to ask Lyle Blackburn, and he said to give him a call, and so I did, and now here he is. I added this bit to the beginning of the show so I wouldn't forget these interesting people that I got to talk to. With us today is Lyle Blackburn. Lyle is a native Texan known for his work in writing, music, film, and cryptid research. He is the author of several acclaimed books, including The Beast of Boggy Creek and Lizard Man, whose subject matter reflects his lifelong fascination with legends and sightings or reports of unknown creatures. Lyle is also the founder of the rock band Ghoultown, columnist for the horror magazine Rue Morgue, and narrator-producer of documentary films such as The Mothman of Point Pleasant and Boggy Creek Monster, in which he also appears on screen. Lyle is a frequent guest on radio programs such as Coast to Coast AM and has been featured on numerous television shows airing on Animal Planet, A Destination America, Discovery Science, and A&E. In his work with Monsters and Mysteries in America, he served as both consulting producer and special episode host. As a musician, Lyle has achieved similar success. His band, Ghoultown, has released 8 albums which have not only earned a loyal worldwide following, but found their way into movies, video games, and numerous live venues across the United States, Canada, and Europe. Highlights include an invitation to write a theme song for iconic horror maven Elvira, Mistress of the Dark. The song's music video featuring Elvira herself was aired on her nationally syndicated show, Movie Macabre. When Lyle isn't writing books, hunting monsters, or performing with his band, he can be found speaking at various cryptozoology conferences and horror conventions around the United States. Just look for that trademark black cowboy hat. Now tell me, which came first, your music or your interest in the bizarre?
That's a lot of stuff. And do we still have time for the show after that long bio? Yeah, it was actually, well, I mean, I was interested in the subjects of, movie monsters and then cryptids, at a very early age. So probably that interest in my memory preceded my, getting into music when I was young and then proceeding to become a musician. So, but, both have always been there.
You grew up in Fort Worth. Were the Goatman sightings a topic of discussion when you were younger?
Well, ironically, they weren't. I mean, they probably were, but I was simply too young to have, noted anything in 1969. So, and in the subsequent years, I don't know if people talked about it or not. So I didn't really know about that case until much later. And in fact, had seen the movie The Legend of Boggy Creek about some incidents in Arkansas prior to me knowing about Lake Worth monsters. So that was something that came much later, which, was obviously a lot closer to where I lived. And, I knew that area, and so did my parents. It's just that nobody had told me about those monster sightings, I guess.
How did you come up with your style of music?
Well, kind of a long process. I've always kind of liked an assortment of musical styles, and, in playing in various rock and roll, punk, and heavy metal bands over the years, I always kind of wanted to do something that was unique. So with Ghoultown, it's kind of a mishmash of all that combined with a little spaghetti western, dark western kind of imagery, and a kind of a format where I can just include any kind of musical influences, and it doesn't really seem, out of place. So it was just a long process of that, and then once I started wearing the black hat and stuff, it just sort of developed from there.
Were you influenced by any one group or one singer in particular?
Not any one in particular, and I think with music I was as much influenced by imagery as I was music. I mean, one of the first bands I loved was Kiss, and obviously they have sort of that recognizable, iconic, stage presence and look. Mm-hmm. And so, to me, my music incorporates almost the motifs of spaghetti western and horror movies and all that. So, the musical influences, perhaps Johnny Cash was an early one where I grew up obviously in Texas and people listened to old country, and it was kind of the first thing I remember. And then got introduced to Kiss and rock and roll. So that just kind of became a all-inclusive influence to me.
Where do you get your inspiration for the songs you write?
I don't know. They just kind of come. Usually I just work on some of the guitar arrangements or something, and I'll literally look around the house, and maybe I've got movie posters and all kinds of memorabilia around the house. So sometimes I just look and see a movie poster, and that gives me an idea for some sort of lyrics, and that stuff just sort of comes out. Little bursts of inspiration, in which I sort of harness and then kind of hone it down to some sort of manageable song.
You do have a very distinctive look with that black cowboy hat. Were you surprised the first time you ran into Ken Gerhardt?
No, I mean, it's funny because he is and was also a frontman for his own rock band, and we kind of developed on parallel paths where we were both interested in the same type of things. We had become musicians and adopted sort of that dark Texas look with the black hats. And the producer who produced a lot of the Ghoultown albums actually played guitar for Ken's band, though I had never met Ken. And so, I don't know, once we met, we realized we were practically brothers, and just our the commonalities and the way we looked. And it's sort of we always laugh at the chicken or the egg, who had the black hat first or this or that. And a lot of people, conjecture at all that, but we really have a good time with people either mistaking one of us for the other guy or whatever. It's always fun, and we're really great friends. So, it kind of developed naturally.
The Jefferson Bigfoot Conference. Did Craig Woolheater contact you, or did you contact him the first time you spoke at the Texas Bigfoot Conference?
Well, I had been friends with Craig during a time when he wasn't the organizer of the conference, and the guys that were organizing the conference at the time, just before my Beast of Boggy Creek book came out, they asked me to speak at when they were having the Texas Bigfoot Conference in Tyler, Texas. Then when Craig took back over and moved it back to Jefferson, where it had been originally, Craig and I were, good buddies, and it was just natural that he asked me to speak when he started doing that conference again.
Doesn't he also live in Fort Worth or near the area?
Yes, yeah, he lives. He's always lived in this area, and in fact, he lives a few miles from me now, which is kind of a funny story because he met a girl who lived over here and ended up staying over here a lot, and she lives on the same street that I grew up on as a kid. I lived there all the way through my entire childhood, and so. Yeah, I lived in Dallas for years and ended up moving back in this area. So we live just literally about 3 miles from each other now.
The Legend of Boggy Creek had quite an impact on your life. Did you see it when it first came out?
I did. I don't know. I think it was several years after it had been playing on the circuit, because I'm just kind of tracing back at my age and trying to get my parents to chip in on when they think they had taken me to the drive-in, but I did see it in an actual drive-in and remember it, well enough. It was just something that grabbed my attention so much that I've probably forgotten other things from that time period, but I can distinctly remember going to that movie and seeing it. And, after seeing it, also, my dad would run around the house and jump out and say, Boggy Creek Monster. So, it kind of affected my whole family. And I just loved it at the time I saw it and had a fond memory of it. And then later on, when I got a VHS and revisited it, it was just as cool as when I had seen it.
Could you give us just a brief rundown of the story?
Yeah, the movie, The Legend of Boggy Creek, came out in 1972, and it was based on sightings of a creature near the town of Fouke, Arkansas, which is located in the southwest portion just across the Texas border. And around 1971, there was some incidents near Fouke in which several people claimed to have seen a tall, upright, hair-covered creature that walked on 2 legs. And in one of these instances, it tried to get in one of the homes, and the guys confronted it and shot at it, and one of the guys ended up tussling with this, alleged creature, and ended up in the hospital. And thereafter, it received some newspaper coverage in the Texarkana Gazette, and it was followed by other witnesses coming forward saying they had seen things as well, to the point where a lot of the old-timers that had lived in the area for decades before, they said, oh, yeah, we've seen a, ape-like, wild man-looking thing down here in the woods for years. It's just that there was no newspaper coverage. So when all that started getting printed in the papers in 1971, a would-be filmmaker by the name of Charles B. Pierce came into town and thought, this is a great subject for a documentary or a film, and he ended up making the Legend of Boggy Creek. That was an extremely successful movie back in the 70s, made for sort of a very cheap budget, but ended up being very effective. And once it got distribution in theaters and drive-ins and later on television, everybody saw that movie, it seems. And so at the core of that, while that's a movie and it kind of dramatizes the sensational aspects of the sightings, it was based on real-life sightings of a Bigfoot-like creature in Arkansas. And those sightings, as I would come to find out in the research of my own book, dated back many, many years to the early 1900s, and it continued even after the 70s, after the movie, all the way till this day. So it's one of those southern Sasquatch creature cases that's become very notable and ultimately famous because it had a movie made.
Pierce kind of left the town with some hard feelings. When you set out to write the book, the Beast of Boggy Creek, did you find resistance from the folks that you tried to interview?
I did encounter some of that. It kind of varied, but of course, when I first showed up in the town, to do some research and to try to talk to the original witnesses or witnesses that had seen something since, they were reserved, and they were suspicious of being made fun of, or anything like that, which is understandable. So it took me a while of going back and kind of gaining the trust of some of the important guys there, like a local historian who helped me a great deal to get people to come and talk to me. Once they figured out that I was, trying to look at this in a serious manner and just simply write the history of the story, they were a little more open. But there were some witnesses that just were done talking about it. They had suffered some ridicule, and they just had a bad taste in their mouth about the subject and just simply wouldn't even talk to me, even though some of their friends did. And ultimately the book was well received by the town. And now it's easier to get reports because they all know who I am and trust me. But early on, it took a little, getting used to me and trusting me.
You spend a lot of time hiking the trails and in around Fouke. Do you ever spend the night out on some of the locations?
Yes, certainly. I've spent many a night out there in locations where there's been significant sightings, and he visited a lot of the locations where the original film was made, and all of that. So yeah, there's been plenty of times I've camped in those areas.
Can you tell us about one of the latest sightings in the area? People are always saying, is there anything new?
Right. Yeah, I often get that. I see it on Facebook quite a bit, that somebody's new to the party and familiar with the old movie, and they'll always ask, has there been any other sightings? And of course, I like to bring people up to date, and if, of course, they've read my Beast of Boggy Creek, they'll well know that there's been numerous sightings that have continued, since that time. The most recent sighting was about 6 months ago. I got a report from a trucker who was driving in the area that saw what he described as a very large something, appeared to be covered in hair, walking on two legs at the edge of the woods. So that would be the most recent. That was one that was a little more brief in nature. There's some going back in the last couple of years that have been better sightings. There was a woman several years ago that was driving up one of the rural county roads one morning at 10 a.m. when she had to do a turnaround, and when she did, there was something coming across the road, and she was able to get a view of this in plain daylight and was able to determine that it wasn't a person in a costume or something like that. There was some sort of an animal that resembled a person, but was covered in hair and turned and ran back in the woods. And it scared this lady. I was lucky to interview her and to be able to, examine the area where she had the sighting, which seemed like a probable place. And there's always those coming up that just I'd say about every 3 or 4 months, there's some sort of a sighting that comes my way.
While filming the Boggy Creek Monster with Small Town Monsters, did you all have any interesting activity?
We did. In fact, during one of the interviews with one of the witnesses who had a couple of interesting encounters and had even found a footprint, we interviewed him at a location that is very close to where he had the encounters, which is actually not far from his home because he literally lives in the woods. And during the course of that interview, we were losing a lot of light. We had trouble getting to the site because it had rained in the previous days, and it was very muddy. And once you leave the blacktop around where his home is, you've got to travel up a pretty good hill, and it's just a dirt road. So it was very muddy, and we couldn't even get one of the cars in there. I had to put most of the filmmakers in the back of my four-wheel drive truck, and we got over there. So we were, racing against light, and the sun was going down, and we were interviewing him, and lo and behold, there was this very unusual howl that came out of the swamps back there, and just without missing a beat during the interview, he said, well, there's one right there. And of course, I've heard that same howl, and we've tried to rule out other animals such as, coyotes, foxes, and panthers and other normal things. And leaving us with the question is, did we hear one of these creatures right there during the interview? So that was a sort of a bonus that you don't normally get when you're out there filming.
Did the film crew kind of stick out in that small town?
Well, yeah. I mean, it was, people knew what was going on, and they, you could spot us, knew what was going on. But it's kind of, business as usual, because there always seems to be a film crew of some sort, whether it's a local news station or just some college kids, filming at the Monster Mart. A lot of times I've just been there when somebody's been filming and they asked to do an interview. So we stood out, but it wasn't anything out of the ordinary. And of course I was leading the parade there, and I pretty much have an all access pass. People know who I am, and I know where to go, and respectful of people's property. So it was no problem at all.
Has the Monster Mart pretty much become your home away from home?
It has. Whenever possible, I'm up there, and, even when I go, just to camp or canoe in the bayous, I always go to the Monster Mart, and I can just pop in there, and people come in and they know me, and I could stay there, all day and talk to different people, enjoy conversations. And occasionally I've walked in and there's been somebody who's visiting from out of town, and they their interest was maybe inspired by not only the Legend of Boggy Creek, but perhaps they had a sighting. So I've gotten a lot of good reports from people by just hanging out at the Monster Mart. So yeah, it's a place where I just love to hang out.
Y'all had a camp out in Falk a few years ago. I was signed up to go, but I wound up having to back out because of family issues. But did the camp out turn out okay?
Well, that ended up, we didn't actually do that. It was something we've been trying to do just simply because people ask. But in the end, we attempted it, and it's just hard to coordinate stuff like that and get the places to go and I don't know. Just having a big group of people in a rugged outdoor place that's, full of snakes and other dangers. I can't remember the exact reasons, but they ended up canceling it. It was mostly kind of coordinated by the Monster Mart. I was just I was just the guy who was going to be there to, give people the history of the creature and tell campfire stories, I suppose. But yeah, it didn't happen. So in the future, it may be something to develop, but for now, it's still on the back burner.
It sounded like a very attractive thing at the time. Like I said, I did sign up. It just life happens and wasn't able to make it. Your latest book, Beyond Boggy Creek, did you look into any other cryptids while you were doing your research? Interesting items that you're holding on for another book?
Beyond Boggy Creek was sort of the way that I could cover a lot of other cases that I had investigated or knew about, or sightings that had come to me, over a period of time. And the premise there was that, Boggy Creek is perhaps the most famous southern Sasquatch case, but there's plenty of really great witness encounters and sightings and historical cases all over the Deep South that are just as interesting. They just, haven't had a famous movie to make them famous. So yeah, indeed, I incorporated a lot of things I've, researched over the years, and I covered 10 states in that, which I consider the deep, deep South. And I've been to every single state that was covered in there, and in many cases been to the areas where, the sightings occurred, and had interviewed, some of the witnesses and so forth. I did find interesting cases that some resembled like a miniature Legend of Boggy Creek, where there had been a small town and numerous sightings of a hair-covered ape-like creature, and the locals knew of it, and, had been plenty of credible encounters dating back many years. And so, yeah, it was a really fun book to do, and a way to sort of cover the whole Deep South, and instead of just one case in particular.
How would you get started in a new town? Did you check in at the library or maybe the police station, or did you already have a contact set up before you arrived?
Usually if it's, a town that has some history, there could be some newspaper reports, or, I could have a witness that I've talked to previously that would volunteer to, show me the area. So that would be kind of where to start. Some of them, I'm en route somewhere, I can drop by the town or whatever, and I just do. And libraries are often a good place. If it's a really small town, if you just show up at one of the restaurants, it's not long before, you can find your way to somebody who knows something about the local legend. So that's kind of the way I operate. But usually I would have some hint of a witness ahead of time, and some contact with somebody in advance that I've interviewed over the phone, and they usually would be the ones that could sort of direct me to the, quickly to where I would need to go to learn more information.
Well, how many miles did you put in, guesstimate?
Oh, well, over the years, there's just no telling. I mean, following the Beast of Boggy Creek, I did a tour all across the eastern portion of the South, just going to different swamps that had significant sightings. And that was a round trip from Texas. I don't know how many miles that is, but that's a loop around the whole bottom quarter of the southern U.S. And some of those cases where I went to, like, for example, the Okefenokee Swamp in southern Georgia, that was something that I covered later in my Beyond Boggy Creek book. Some of the other stuff would be, like I spoke at in the International Cryptozoology Conference, which was held in Florida several years ago. So I just went out there in advance and got with one of my research partners that lives in Georgia, and we went down to the Ocala National Forest there in Florida, which is a place where there's been skunk ape sightings, and, did an investigation before I went to the, spoke at the conference. So I usually try to, if I'm going to an area, I look at, see what's there and try to work those two together to sort of, make the most of a excursion to another state. So over the years, I mean, if you want to count all the times I've been to these states, even in for the purposes of playing music, I could stop at places along the way or whatever I could do. It's just, I've been a lot of miles.
And can you tell the listeners one of the more interesting stories that you encountered?
Well, let's see. Oh, there's just so many. There's one that always I like from East Texas, near the border. It's basically on the border of Louisiana and East Texas, in an area of kind of swampy, heavy woods. And I had come about knowing this witness through his daughter, and in talking about Bigfoot and other things, she just happened to mention, oh, well, my father, he saw something when he was younger, and of course I'm like, oh, really? Well, maybe I definitely need to talk to your father. So I ended up interviewing this individual, and he had an encounter back in 1969, located there in the swampy area. And what they did was he and his brother used to go hunting and fishing back in those woods, and they would stay back there for days. They were very familiar with, the local wildlife and everything else. And in one area, they had built this sort of crude wooden tree house where they would sleep overnight. And one evening, they had caught a bunch of fish and, had cooked it up, and they threw the fish cleanings off into the woods somewhere, and they were up sleeping in the treehouse, and something woke him up, and he kind of started to look out, figuring he'd see whatever raccoons or something, rummaging through the leftovers. But when he looked out, and there was enough moonlight that he could see fairly well, there was something huge standing there, and it was rummaging through these fish remains. And he said it stood up, and it stood up. It was taller than a man. He said it could tell it was covered in fur. It did not look like a bear. And, of course, he's looking through sort of the slats of this crudely constructed shack, and his brother was still asleep. So he's trying to wake his brother up. He's looking at this thing, and in the course of that, I guess they made some noise, and when his brother started to look up, whatever this thing was noticed and looked up at them and, kind of gazed for a few seconds, and then it turned and just ran into the woods very quickly. Well, of course, this scared them to death, and they weren't about to get out of that treehouse till daylight. And when they did, they went out there and looked around and found huge 5-toed tracks there in the soft soil, and found even some hair that had been rubbed off when this thing turned and ran into the bush. And so, he described the track to me, which obviously resembles very much a Bigfoot track. But at the time, he didn't really equate this with Bigfoot. He did not know how to explain it. And, it was something that just stayed with him all these years. And then later on kind of started thinking, well, maybe I saw a Bigfoot. Well, this is an area that has a lot of sightings in it, of course. And, I was lucky to have interviewed this and brought forth this story, which I think is extremely credible. This isn't a guy running out looking for fame and fortune. He just simply saw something he can't explain. So that's one of those that's in the Beyond Boggy Creek book, and one that I think is highly intriguing.
You've been on a lot of TV shows. Have you lost count yet?
No, I can still pretty much keep track. I think I try to narrow it down to the I pass on a number of shows that I don't think you got to watch out with that stuff. I try to do the ones that seem to have the most integrity, but so far I haven't done too many that I can't remember.
You were on HGTV's Home Strange Home. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, that was an interesting one, where the premise of that show was to show people who had, strange architecture or had strange collections or whatever. And so mine was that my house looks fairly standard on the outside. It's not wacky or anything. But if you come inside, I've got a huge collection of horror movie memorabilia. I've got cryptozoology artifacts and footprints, and of course movie posters and all kinds of relics from the Boggy Creek area and from the Legend of Boggy Creek movie. So I was profiled on as part of that show, and I kind of even hosted my own episode. I just kind of give a guided tour of my house. So that was pretty neat, and something that's easy to film. I didn't have to go, wading through a swamp or anything. They just came to my house and it was done in one day.
You were the host of the Mothman movie from Point Pleasant. Can you tell us about that one?
Well, in working with Small Town Monsters on the Boggy Creek Monster documentary, we had a really good experience. And obviously in the Boggy Creek case, it was pretty much my research and things that we hinged on to, as part of the movie. Well, that turned out well, so we thought, hey, let's continue this relationship into some of the new documentaries that they wanted to do. And the next one was the Mothman of Point Pleasant. So in that case, we collaborated, Seth and I, to co-write the script, and I narrate that one, which, I've kind of come to like this narration thing, just doing the voiceovers for films. That's pretty fun. So it was great to do it for the Mothman. I'm, been a long time, the Mothman is one thing I've researched and been interested in, and I've been up into Point Pleasant before. So it was a natural fit for me to kind of voice the film and to work with Seth on that. And it turned out fantastic. I think, it's possibly the most, viewed film of the Small Town Monsters catalog to date.
Were you able to find any witnesses when you were up there that were still alive in the area and willing to talk to y'all?
There's a few. It's getting tough because, that case took place in 1966, 67, and, a lot of the witnesses at the time were at least late teens or, beyond. So, when you start getting back that far, just like with Boggy Creek, a lot of the original witnesses have passed on. So, there's a few that we were able to find that had some, with, encounters that were significant. Luckily, Jeff Walmsley, who runs the Mothman Museum there in Point Pleasant, he had, interviewed many people and had voice recordings. So in some cases, Seth just had to use old voice recordings or old videos of some of the witnesses that had passed on in order to, tell the full scope of the story. So luckily, there's guys like Jeff that had the wherewithal to investigate some of this and to put the the interviews on tape. So we had to use those where possible. But there's a lot of people that remember that, and even historians that may not have actually had a sighting, but they were there. They were there during all that, and were willing to come on camera and to tell the stories and their perspective of the effects of the Mothman case on that little town.
During your travels, have you ever run into anyone along the lines of the Men in Black?
I've not personally, had a run-in with any person like that. I've talked to people who claimed to have been visited by, Men in Black type things. But I can't think of any time where, anybody's approached me that seemed, not something other than what they were, or that seemed like they were from a government agency so far.
Have you had any bizarre investigations where you thought, this is just too weird?
Honestly, it's hard to define what's too weird, because I've heard all sorts of manner of weirdness, and I'm sure you're familiar. That there's just a lot of strange things that happen that people witness or know about. But nothing I would say has been too weird, other than occasionally I do get a witness that's telling me some story that I just don't buy. I rule these out. These aren't the kind of things I would cover in my book. And it's usually fairly obvious as to the ones that I don't seem like they've, experienced what they say they've experienced, or they're just delusional. I don't know. But those are the weird ones that I just disregard, basically. But I've heard some weird stuff, and lately there's been some very weird encounters that people have reported with dog man type entities or creatures, or even dog-like creatures. I've gotten several of those lately that are just hard to explain. They're just bizarre. I believe the witnesses. They saw something, but I just can't explain what the heck it was.
You've never had a situation, though, where you're, say, out in the woods somewhere, out in a swamp, and you suddenly realize that perhaps you're being stalked by something or followed?
Well, there's that. There was an incident that happened to myself and one of my research buddies several years ago in the Mercer Bayou swamp area near Fouke. And in that case, it was about midnight. We were paddling up the bayou in the complete dark when we heard a strange howl come from about at least 100 yards away, perhaps more. And it's hard to hear stuff when you get a lot of ambient noise of frogs and all this stuff, and we're rowing the canoe. So we stopped when we heard the first howl, and then about 45 seconds later it came again. And so now we can really concentrate, and we're definitely confident it wasn't a coyote or a wolf or something. And then it howled again. And, of course, we were very excited. This sounded, very intriguing. We waited for a while. It never howled again. So now we kind of began to go back down the bayou, back to where we were camped about a mile away. You can hear us moving. Something with good hearing could definitely hear us in the woods. And so we get back to our camp and pull the pull the canoe out on the shore and go up this little hill. And about the time we got up on a hill, all of a sudden we heard this howl again. And this time, whatever it was right across the other side of the bayou channel from where we just got out. And again, it did 3 howls spaced from about 45 seconds apart. And again, we are definitely sure at this point that is not an animal we can identify. And our feeling was at the time that whatever that was had, come up to the edge of the bayou and perhaps followed us all the way down as we rode. And it still stayed on the other side of the bayou, but had, possibly stalked us or whatever. And of course, we went down there with flashlights and tried to see whatever it was, but could never get a visual on it.
It sounds almost like the thing was following you all down the river.
It seems like it. I mean, that was kind of there's only been a couple of times where I'm actually gotten spooked out there. And I mean, again, we're rowing up a swamp in the middle of the night in complete darkness, and that, so we're comfortable in those situations. But this was something totally different. I was spooked after that.
Anything like the movie Willow Creek by Bobcat Goldthwait?
Well, we didn't get that dramatic or anything, but as much as we're going to get spooked, it was spooky. Now, I think if you would have put somebody in that position that wasn't as comfortable or had that much experience in the woods, literally, I think they could have, come across very much like the Willow Creek movie.
That was the absolute wrong movie to let my wife watch before we went camping out in the woods. And, well, every time we go, she mentions it.
Yeah, no, what were you thinking there? That's a sure way to get her to not want to go. But to me, that's the fun of it because, something weird might happen.
Yeah, there was the time they were showing it there in Jefferson, so.
Oh, right.
Where can folks get your books and videos?
Well, they're available in most places, Amazon, BarnesandNoble.com. The videos can be streamed from Amazon, iTunes, all those sort of places. If you have Amazon Prime, I believe you can watch The Mothman of Point Pleasant this month. We've got it on Prime. The best place to find links to all this stuff, including my band, would be to visit my website at lyleblackburn.com, and that would have links to information and anything you want to know.
When and where is your next conference?
My next appearance is this weekend at Texas Frightmare, which is more of a horror convention. I'm actually screening The Mothman of Point Pleasant there, and that's in Dallas, Texas. And beyond that, there is going to be the first annual Lizard Man Festival in Bishopville, South Carolina, coming up June 8th through the 10th. I've written a book called The Lizard Man, The True Story of the Bishopville Monster, which is about a strange reptilian humanoid case from South Carolina. So, as many of these small towns do, there ends up being some sort of an event centered around that. So this is going to be the first event centered around the Lizard Man. So that's going to be exciting, and see how that turns out. But you can find links to all these appearances as well on my website. Without
giving away too many details, could you tell the audience just briefly about the Lizard Man sightings?
That case took place mainly in the late 80s, and it revolved around sightings outside of this small town of Bishopville in an area called Scape-Ore Swamp, in which people reported seeing a large 7-foot-tall reptilian humanoid type creature, and the locals gave it the name Lizard Man. And most notably, it was said to have attacked a young boy who had the unfortunate luck of having a flat tire in Scape-Ore Swamp in the middle of the night. And this boy was indeed attacked by something. Something, came up and tried to chase him into his car, and he barely got away and ended up reporting that to the police. And that was sort of the spark. There was several other people came forward and sightings that went for several more years of this strange creature there in Bishopville, and had some crazy media coverage of it and the usual things that surround these small town monsters cases. So that was one that to me was always intriguing and rather spooky, because people were essentially saying they had seen what seemed like a modern creature from the Black Lagoon, right here in the middle of America. So that was a cool case, and one that I wanted to investigate and write a book about.
Do you have any words of advice for any young folks or older folks out there that are considering becoming a cryptozoologist?
Well, I suppose the words of advice would be don't expect to turn this into a career necessarily. I mean, there's no accreditation to become a cryptozoologist, and I'm often reluctant to call myself that, because it's purely, anybody can, I suppose, adopt that title. I just kind of do it as lack of a better term, but it is definitely something that if you do it for fun, do it for your own enjoyment first and foremost, and not as a way to make a living, because truly there's really not much fame, glory in it. I mean, I'm a professional writer and a musician, so the cryptozoology part is just simply the subject that I pursue in these writings. So if you're wanting to get into it, it's very fascinating, very fun, and something that I think people should enjoy.
I really appreciate you coming on the show tonight, and hopefully we'll have you on again sometime.
Definitely. Always good to talk to you, and I appreciate you having me on the show.
Thank you much. This has been Lyle Blackburn on Strange Things. Back in 1776, someone said, "Give me coffee or give me death." And if that's how you feel, you should be at the Organic Man Coffee Truck. They make coffee the right way, one delicious cup at a time. 4501 McPherson, Suite number 9. Coffee, the stuff dreams are made of.
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man, the same murder 3? Strange things that happen here, how stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?